not great. And I think it's just been disheartening to know, even when you talk to reading experts, that there is no real clear response to why can't Alex read, other than, and I'm anxious to hear Phylicia's response to this. I think I've heard for the very first time that teachers, the majority of teachers, are not taught to teach reading. And so I think that's a big assumption that you make. And I'm finding out that most teachers don't know how to teach a kid to read, which is alarming. And I'm finding out that most
Okay.
So to respond to that, yes. Um, I think what we talked about previously was like when students enter school and kinder going through elementary, really kind of third grade, students are learning how to read and learning kind of those phonics and everything that goes into reading. But if the student does not capture that, and they're kind of just pushed through the system, then there's no necessarily a catch up for the students who don't have a recorded disability or recorded special education accommodation for reading. Now, sometimes if a student does not meet a certain standard by a certain time, then they are then placed in reading recovery and thus deemed as a student who needs special education, or not even special education sometimes, but it's called teacher terms of 504, where they would get help or outside help in order to be able to meet those standards. And so, but generally speaking, yes, students can be pushed through the system, and we see it all the time with students just being pushed through the system, um, even though they struggle in an area. As long as they behave well, as long as they're not seen as disruptive, then they can really kind of float under the radar and not get kind of pinpointed or noticed sometimes. Yeah.
Okay. All righty. I wanted to also go back and again say, because I think we had a problem in connecting at the very beginning. But if people have comments, please, if you would, just share what those comments are. Search under the title. The conversation continues, contending for our children. So please check there. If you didn't, for some reason, there was a breakdown in our telecast. And of course, we're meeting with Terry Barnes and Phylicia Anderson on this conversation. So I'm kind of restating it for those. If you do have comments, please put them in the section that says comments, and we will try to address that. Today, we have a total of 5 questions, and we're going to leave quite a bit of time at the end for those of you who have questions that you would like to pose around our topic today. But we do want to engage and make this as interactive as possible. One of the things that I had mentioned earlier that was on July the 30th, the NIA project, partnering with Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church and In the Word Ministries, did a contending for our children. We had several guests, including the interim superintendent of schools, who shared with us kind of the plan and the activities. Superintendent shared those. So those are also available if you go to the website, Metro MBC, you'll be able to see those comments that are there. But Superintendent Collier was there along with others who gave us interesting input. Afterwards, we did breakout sessions around reading and around mental health. And in reading specifically, there were 3 recommendations that I'll share with you. The first is to raise awareness of this crisis in the faith community to help congregations really understand the crisis and the impact of illiteracy on families and communities. That was the first. The second was support and equip parents and members to advocate for children. And then lastly, explore the best approach, which we've been in search of, to effectively address those reading deficiency, whether it's tutoring, mentoring, access to community resources. So those were the recommendations. Phylicia, are we kind of headed in the right direction, seeing that 85% of third graders in the Kansas City public schools and charter schools are not proficient in reading? Are we headed in the right direction?
I would definitely say yes. I'm humbled to even give a response to a superintendent, but I would say definitely yes, headed in the right direction. I believe that communities, especially Black communities, need to create more organizations, as we talked about last time, where we strengthen our organizations so that we are able to provide those resources to our students. And so much pressure is not just put on the schools, and so much pressure is not just put on the parents, but communities can respond as well and take a piece of that ownership, because it takes a village to raise a child. And so if we all come together and work collectively, then yes, and provide those supports for our students, then I believe we're definitely headed in the right direction.
Okay. Well, let me ask you, let's open it up for our first question, and then I'll open up your presentation slides. The first question that we have up for today is this, which was a question that we asked the last time when we were together. And that question was, true or false? Literacy is the ability to read and write using standard English. And so we are going to begin with you, Phylicia, on this, and then we'll open up and let the comments start coming in.
Okay. So we talked last time about kind of redefining what literacy actually means and what it means to be articulate, and more specifically, what it means to be articulate while Black, and how that may not be the norm or considered the norm with where we are in today's society. And so we talked about the standardized testing, and with that comes the danger of a single story, in that a single number that is sometimes placed on a student is not the whole story about who that student is, or even their development and education. And so we looked at how race, language, and power all play a part in the educational development of our students, and can play a part going forward, and how those things need to be wrapped within the Black literacy framework to understand how literacy can be built in both standard English as well as in Black literacy or Black language. So yes.
Okay. Terry, you have any thoughts on that? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to make sure that what we're hearing or seeing from some of the people we've been talking to, if this has even been discussed. I think the first time we've really addressed it has been with Phylicia, and really understanding what Black literacy and those impacts in those three arrows.
Yeah, and I think the first response that I have to that is it takes me back a little bit, because as a parent or as a community member, are we saying that, because the reality is we live in the United States of America, right? So are we saying we're going to lower what whoever has defined the bar as acceptable, are we're going to change that bar for our children, and understand, even though it could be correct, it's going to have a negative impact on them in the larger world if they can't read standard English. So can you, because that's what I feel like I heard you say, Black literacy, Black language framework, that is different than what we have today. And although I think we would all agree that it's okay for it to be different, the world is not going to be accepting of that. And it's going to have a more difficult effect on how our kids navigate success in these United States.
Yes. And that is a great point. the goal is for us to not have to conform to our current environment, but to be able to transform where we are, transform the mindsets of the people that we interact with on a daily basis, to say there's not one standard, but there are multiple standards. Black literacy, Black language has a standard of its own. A person, Joe Schmo off the street, can't come around talking Black language and it be acceptable to everybody. Just like standard English has a standard that is assessed by the community. And so I think when I was creating this presentation, I was just like, who has this answer? Who has an example of what this means? Like transforming, but then also looking at the reality of the situation in that these kids got to pass a standardized test at the end of the day. That's really where we are. And so I thought about Lean on Me and how those students were considered at that time, Eastside High, they were considered in the bottom percentage of their community, and that school could not get their kids to pass a standardized test. And the purpose of the principal was to come in and get those students to pass the test. And so he did that by not only teaching to the test, because the only way, honestly, to pass a standardized test is to teach specifically to the test, understand the questions that are being asked, how those questions are being formed, and the answer that the people who created that test, the answer that they're looking for. Whether you agree with that answer or not is irrelevant. The purpose is for you to understand how they thought when creating the test, is standardized testing. And we know, I disagree with standardized testing. And so I'm on my soapbox here, but we know that test is created for a specific demographic and is not created for all equally, because if it were so, we would see a lot more cultural representation and standardized testing, and that is just not the case. And so here we are with this dilemma now of having to conform to a society that we've always kind of taught ourselves and our children to speak against the grain, which is really what Black language is. It's purposefully taking standard English and twisting it in a way that is unique and a way that other people can't necessarily understand what we're saying. And so when we take those things, looking at the conforming to the world versus transforming the world to be more open-minded, we look at Lean on Me. And so in that movie, he taught to the test, but he also was purposeful, and the teachers were also purposeful to include Black literacy while they were transforming the minds of the students to learn the standards that were required to pass the test. And so I don't feel like we need to separate the two ideas of we only have to learn standard English or we only have to learn Black language. I think currently where we are today, yes, it would be ideal to where our kids could really develop their home literacy and only their home literacy before learning another language. But that's just not the reality we live in. And so where we are is we need to look for ways to transform the curriculum to be more equitable and to transform standardized testing to be more equitable. But even before we get to that step, we need to look for ways to educate our kids using what they do know to take them to what they don't know. And so that kind of went through the whole purpose diagram here with assessment, and then creating support is what we'll get to a little bit later tonight. But just the purpose, we need to start with determining, are we conforming? And is that our main purpose? Because if we're conforming, then I'm teaching to the test. And I'm teaching specifically what that test is asking. And if I'm transforming, then I'm bringing in elements of Black literacy to help that student understand the importance of their culture, but then how that culture can be used to strengthen their understanding of another culture.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
And I like the circle that talks about strategies for contending support, because I think we've been using the word supplement, but even support is very different than supplement. We're not trying to teach reading. We're trying to support and develop strategies of support for children so that they can be successful, and combining them. I think that'll take us to the next question was.
Before you go to the next question, can I ask a question?
Sure.
This is an easy one. While you were talking, Phylicia, I thought about this. So are you saying, and I'm sure the standardized test has been updated since I was in school, because this whole idea of cultural competence is not a new discussion at this point. One of the things that dawned on me as I listened to you talk is I have never seen a standardized test to know what types of questions children are seeing and how it's worded, what words they're using. Do teachers have an opportunity to see those tests? And are those tests culturally competent at this point?
So there are questions like, I remember I'm in Texas, and so we take STAR. Our students take STAR. And so, yes, teachers are provided with a test as far as examples of the questions that could be on the test and what they may look like for the students. And so we are able to say, okay, this is the wording that you may see. This is what they're really asking you when they use this type of word or this vocabulary. And so if you see this vocabulary, don't get stuck. You need to just remember that it's asking you this question. And so, yes, we teach vocabulary as far as like what the test is asking for the students. And what teachers are seeing is that there is a lack of transfer between what they're learning in the classroom and what's being asked of them to answer on a standardized test, because they can see it in the real world, but then they can't transfer that knowledge to a test question. And so, yes, teachers are purposeful to teach how to answer a specific question on the test. Those
Phylicia?
tests are not as culturally competent as they could be. There has been progress to include more diversity, but at the end of the day, there's still room for growth, lots of room for growth.
Can you give a real example of what you just said when you said the kid is not able to transfer what they have seen to the paper of what the question is asking?
Yes. So, for example, in math, they may ask, and I teach English, so this is kind of a almost real example, but just from conversations I've had with previous teachers. So in math, they may see a question about, for example, 1 + 1 is 2, but then on the test, they see the man went 1 mile, and then he went an additional 1 mile to go and get bread from the store. How many miles did the man go? And the student is like, well, how did he get to the store? Did he drive, walk? Did he, and so they're caught up on the story element of the test, the word problem, and they're missing out on just the math problem and being able to answer that question.
Okay.
All right. Are we ready for our next question?
Yes.
Next question. And I think we kind of addressed that in grades 1 through 3. This is a true or false. In grades 1 through 3, children learn to read. After that, children read to learn. Looking for our comments from our audience. We've got some people out there. I see your eyes upon us. So what are your thoughts on this? Is this true or is this false? Okay.
True.
Okay, the answer is true. Okay, and I am going to again move on in our slides. And people, okay, here we go. Thank ya. Mayaka Hod says true. Okay. All right, let's go from there then, Phylicia. Thank you, Mayaka.
Yes. Do you mind putting the question back up again? Sorry.
The question was, in grades 1 through 3, children learn to read. After that, children read to learn.
Yes, true. Kind of. Children are always learning to read, and children are always reading to learn, really. And so really is true, but then is also true, if that makes sense. And so this goes back to the reading transaction that we talked about last time. And so as children learn to read, then, oh, I think we're on the next slide.
The
Are we?
next
Oh,
one.
never. Yes. I think this talks about the next one with assessment.
Okay.
Sorry.
You want it here or no slide?
The next one.
Okay.
And then yes, ma'am.
Yeah, there we go.
And so reading is just, of course, the skill of being able to read the printed material. Comprehension comes in with the ability to understand what they're reading. So as children learn to read, then they are learning what the text is trying to get them to understand. And so as children learn to read, then that means the text is giving meaning to them as the reader. Whereas when children read to learn, then they're kind of imposing their understandings up onto the text and using that transaction to create knowledge then about their environment. And so, with that being said, as children learn to read, yes, that includes phonics, that includes A plus B equals C type of situations. But then at the end of the day, it's not just about them being able to learn how to read. It's also about them being able to understand what they're reading. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense.
Yes, it does. And being able to transfer that, it seems like a big gap that we have is taking the knowledge and transferring it into situations where that reading makes sense. And like you say, taking information and transferring it into real knowledge that will help them to navigate.
So, Phylicia, and I know you've answered this question before in our first discussion, but I guess I just want to hear you explain it again. Um, so, tell us why from pre K to third grade, children are not learning how to read. Because this is where the teachers that know how to teach to read, this is where all that work is happening, and it's not working. So, can you tell us again what is happening in the schools or at home or whatever the environment the kid is in? What has happened to where our children are not where they should be at third grade?
So again, a lot of factors take, into
Yeah.
consideration as far as race, language, and power, and just their ability. Looking at standard English is not necessarily the first language that Black students learn. Our first language is Black language at the home. And so just it takes 5 years to learn a language, 4 to 5 years. And so as students come into the classroom, they start instruction at a level assuming the student already knows standard English and has been speaking standard English from 0 to 5 years old, when that's not necessarily the case. They've been speaking Black language from 0 to 5 years old. And then they come into the classroom and are told the way you speak at home is not the way you speak in the classroom. Therefore, you're like, either your home is incorrect. And so then that causes an identity issue, and they retract and pull back from education to where they're like, you're talking about my mama. Like, what I learn at home is correct because I've been learning the last 5 years of my life. And so for you to say I'm correct is to say how my mother is speaking is incorrect. And so I have an issue with that. And now I have an issue with education. And
Thank
so
you for that.
really,
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we learned, have been seeing as a trend also is the nature of the school systems now is more of one of social services, where we're concerned with our children being clothed and fed and safe. Issues, as far as abuse. And we're doing so many of those other things in order to take care of the child that education has kind of been pushed to the back, because it's like, how do I care for that kid who walks in my class and they have a busted lip? Or they have, huh?
No, I was just going to say, and we're sending our kids less prepared because, again, I remember it was always before they go to kindergarten, your kid has to know their numbers and their colors and their
Yeah,
ABCs and their
yeah.
shapes. Uh, that was kind of the parents' responsibility. And, you kind of had fun with it to make sure you know your name, your phone number, and all these things. And what I'm hearing from teachers, our children are coming into the classroom and they don't know any of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes,
So,
and at that time, a lot more pre-K programs, kindergarten programs were being funded by the government to help with that. Technically speaking, in Texas, it is not a requirement for kids to go to kindergarten. Their instruction starts in first grade. Now, there are, of course, programs to help fund kindergarten so that the students do get that instruction, but that's not a requirement for a lot of schools is to have students even attend kindergarten. And so, yeah, that's definitely an issue.
and Kansas and Missouri has not been particularly friendly with pre-K and funding pre-K at all. As much as we have lobbied for it, states really don't see the value of it. But they will see the value as they begin to look for employees who have skill sets that match their job opportunities that they have. Okay,
Felicia, oh,
go ahead, Terry.
so Felicia, I don't know, this may not be a fair question, but the other thing that we heard a lot in these, I'll call them listening sessions, as we're talking to different people, is a new superintendent comes, and so a new program comes, and so there's this constant change of what's effective and what'll work, and the teachers really never learn and master one thing before they're asked to do another thing. Would you say that's a significant reason, or do you think that's just something that in teaching you learn to kind of deal with and you manage? How big a deal is the approach to reading to
Well,
the success?
well, I think everyone has a role to play in that. I think if superintendents were able to create programs that were sustainable and research evidence based, that were sustainable to carry through. But the reality is we have teacher shortages across the
Yeah,
nation.
yeah, right.
So
Mm-hmm.
how do they even implement a program when there are no teachers that are staying there to learn the program? And then secondly, the thing I always say, the knowledge that I gained while getting my doctoral degree is knowledge I should have had coming into the classroom my first year teaching. And
Wow.
so I feel like first year bachelor's degree is just how do you teach, how do you manage kids, how do you develop a lesson, where even if we just started in the bachelor's degree talking about programs and strategies that are helpful for all students, and there's a little bit of that, but that's not the main focus. And so if we were able to even transform those programs and then give those teachers the freedom to incorporate those strategies into the classroom and then produce the research out of it. So the structure is there, but there is a lack in overturning with teachers and the teacher shortage. And then there's a lack in knowledge of how to sustain those programs with teachers who don't necessarily get a degree in education, because I didn't. And so how do you develop that knowledge for a teacher just coming in learning how to teach?
And one of the other considerations we learned also is that a lot of the colleges that had schools of education are closing them. So therefore, not only is there a shortage of teachers, but there are schools that no longer teach education. So where are they getting them? And we've noticed and identified some, even here in Kansas City, Missouri, where they are taking individuals who have their bachelor's degree and then sharing teaching principles and guidelines so that they can go out. But we don't even have enough people who are enrolling in schools of education. Not only a shortage, but we're going to have a shortage of places that develop teachers. It's really scary when you think about it. I think we're ready for the next question.
Wait.
Next question. Question 3, true or false? Black children in today's society don't like to read.
True.
False.
Okay, good. Nice split. Let's see if we have any comments up here. No comments on that one. All right, let's address that question. And why is it happening?
So I think children really do like to read. I think we talked about this in the last session, and that, yes, as Mayaka said, it depends on the child. And if that child likes, and it depends on the child and it depends on the specific book. I will say that as well. It's not that they don't like to read, because children can spend hours on social media, not just watching videos, but reading through their comments and all of that. And so they're reading something, but we just need to focus that attention a little bit more on, okay, what is it that you actually like to read, and what is going to actually develop a little bit more knowledge about education than knowledge about the world.
Okay. Terry?
No, I think you're right. I think my comment that children don't like to read is just anecdotal. I mean, most kids that I'm around, kids that I tutored, kids that are in school now don't like to read. And I think they don't like to read because they were not introduced to books that were interesting to them. And reading feels like a punishment because they don't read well. And so it's, hey, get in the corner and read for 20 minutes. And they, pick a book and read. Well, it should not be that way. And so kids don't learn a healthy love for reading. And so maybe they do love to read, but the ones that I run into and the ones that are around the church and the ones that are in the community, they don't. And I think they don't because of the environment that we've created around reading has not been positive and supportive and of interest to them. And it feels like a punishment.
Miss Portia said it also depends on the environment.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, really interesting in Sunday school. Now, if you have a book that they're interested in or something up, like if you turn it into a puzzle or a game or buying vowels to fill out the phrase, they will read that. But if you give them the Bible and say, okay, I want you to read this scripture, I mean, they freeze. Just think of that. And plus, we give them a King James version.
Oh,
So
God.
it's full of these and they and those,
So
I think that's
punishment.
horrible. I know. I mean, but there are arguments as far as which version. I just want them to read what they can understand. I don't care. It could be a cartoon for that standpoint. But
Phylicia, what? Sorry.
Go ahead.
Phylicia, one of the other things that we heard is, and I say listening to her, as we talked to all these different people, literally somebody said to us that just getting a kid to read is not going to be helpful. This idea that just like if I were to tutor a kid and I would sit with them and I'd have them read and I'd read the word and they read with me, there was a very strong pushback that is not enough. That does not make sense to me at all. But that was a strong opinion of an expert, that it's not just about getting a kid to read more. Have you heard that, and can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. I actually have that on, I think the next slide shows us the difference in just reading. Reading is definitely important. Just reading is transformational. And so it's kind of hard to see here, but the blue line is of a low-income student that has resources at home or has a book in their hand, and the growth that they experience on test scores, even though I hate standardized tests. And the red line shows a low-income student with no access to a book and the decline that is actually experienced because they don't read at home during the summer, which is why we see a lot of summer reading programs, is because it is transformational just for a kid to sit down for 30 minutes. It does not matter what they're reading, as long as they're reading. It could be the newspaper, it can be the Bible, it can be reading to their siblings a children's book. And so where that comment comes from is when they're talking about leveling and the student being able to read at their level. And so with leveling, you want the student to read at their level +1, and then they can grow in their knowledge of vocabulary and understanding and development. However, one, we want the kid to love reading. So that's step one, because if they love something, they're going to continue to do it. So step one is they develop a love of reading. And then step two is they develop a comfortability with being able to read and say the words. Step three, they will go out and find books that challenge them. If you have step 1 and 2 completed, then step 3 will take care of itself, and they will find books to their level +1. And they won't just continue to read the books that are easy for them because they won't be satisfied with that. They're going to go and search for books that are a little bit more challenging for them, or books that are of interest to them. Just think about how we do it as adults. If we read a book, I mean, it's no longer fulfilling for us to just pick up a children's book anymore. We're going to be purposeful in finding a book that is at our level, and we have had no one instruct us to do that necessarily, and we just do it. And so
Ms. Portia has said nature versus nurture. It starts in the home. Reading can be fun if it is introduced to the child that way.
yes.
And usually she says it's not.
Yeah, I'll push back on that only to say that that same statement should go to schools, because again, as a parent who, it just irritates me to no end to point fingers at parents, and I'm not saying parents don't have a role and responsibility, but kids are in the school building 7 and 8 hours a day. And so this whole idea of introducing fun and to me, those are the experts. Not that, again, not the parents shouldn't do that, but I just think if it's not starting at home, there's no reason it shouldn't be in school. And from what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing, reading is not a fun thing at school. It is a punishment. And it's not something that's done in a positive, light, enjoying delivery.
Yeah. And I mean, I think
it's also, and I know we always need to take these things into consideration of what's happening in that classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a balance, definitely a balance between, like you said, learning to read and reading to learn. It's not always fun learning to read, but it is fun when you get to read to learn and discover new things. And so that's what's taking place in the classroom, is both of those things. And I see both sides of it as well, because sometimes parents don't have the resources to be able to provide books for their children, which is where the community comes into play. And so it's not just one person. It takes the entire group of educators, parents, as well as the community working together, seeing what our children need, and not necessarily pointing the finger at one person versus the next, but all pointing the finger at ourselves to say, what can I do in order to make sure these children are reading?
Okay, a multiple choice. Who's responsible for teaching children to read?
Sesame Street.
The school.
Yes.
The school's parents, or the community?
Community. Everybody.
Okay. Portia said, yes, I agree on the last one. All parents. Okay, we're getting split decisions on this. Both teachers and parents. Wow, we had lots of opinions on this. All of them, parents, teachers and parents. No one answered community.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay.
Well, I guess maybe because the community is made up of teachers and parents, but there are also
That's
people
so
who work.
good. That was so good, Phylicia. That was good.
But there are also people who don't have children.
Responsible.
Yeah, even the people in the community who may be retired, who maybe their children are grown and gone, the people who have not yet had children, the young adults. Yeah, everybody's responsible.
And Portia has said, define community.
Yeah. So I
And
think what community, that's your church organizations. Um, I think we talked last time about basketball programs because that's what my son is in. Sports, as far as what I grew up with, and going to the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center. And so just volunteers that help give their time to support the students. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And other people's children.
okay. All right. And I think we're going to go to our last question. And the question is, what is the solution to our reading shortfall? More teachers, parental involvement, or better books? We've talked about all these things.
More, and so more teachers, but more trained teachers is what I am taking away from these conversations we're having. You know, teachers can only do what they know how to do, and they do their best, but if they're not trained,
Yeah.
Well,
specifically as
usually the training, I'm just saying this from my classroom experience, and I taught special education, is that you get the curriculum. The curriculum has a teacher's manual and a list of suggested activities of what you can do. And that becomes the specific reading, other than reading methods that you may get in college, as far as kind of the principles and the history and how do you roll it out. But any ongoing training has to be based on what that teacher does. Like we see Phylicia here, who is working on multiple degrees in reading, which allows her to really understand that. And everyone isn't at that point of passion. Okay, all answers.
Felicia,
Okay.
one of the things that I wanted to ask you, and this is again from a Du Bois Learning Center history background, this idea of having to have a curriculum. We've had curriculum, and I say we, back then, we had curriculum at different times for different things, but I never ever felt that anybody believed that our reading program was successful because we used a particular curriculum. We had spelling words, we had books we read, we had worksheets, we had these different ways that we would read out loud and the kid would read out loud, and that worked. And so today, as we begin to have these conversations, there's a lot of chatter around assessments and diagnostics, and well, that only measures two parts of reading. It's really five parts of reading, and is it structured reading or is it phonics or is it? And I just feel like for a community-based program, which is what we are talking about, it's just not necessary. But people are very caught up on, well, what curriculum are you going to use? What assessment tool are you going to use? You can't just have a kid read and that work, because just if that was the case, reading, all the kids would be able to read if all they had to do was read. There's more to it than that. Can you kind of speak to that?
And we talked about that. Now, and then I'll turn over to Phylicia. We talked earlier about the assessment and our whole process of trying to identify an assessment for this program, this initiative that we're starting, and the difficulty in that. And what did you tell me, Phylicia? There were two basic elements of every assessment. What are those two basics?
So when you're assessing reading, every single assessment asks the student to read. And every student assessment asks the student to explain what they've read. Any assessment that you see that tests reading is going to ask those two things. Can you read? Can you read, like, what does the word say? And then can you understand what that word means, or what that sentence or what that phrase or passage means? And so
And if
really,
they can't,
then
that
you know
tells you where to start.
Exactly.
Tells you where to start. So you get
Exactly.
a third grade kid and you give them a third grade book and they struggle with it, can't read it. You give them a second grade book and they can kind of muddle their way through it. You give them a first grade book and they're flying. So you're just saying you just adjust until you get one that they're comfortable, they get stronger, and then you keep moving it up.
Yes. And so
It's
I would really start at the lowest point and then move up. So, hey, read this book to your sibling, or let's just have a day where we all just pick our favorite children's book, especially if you're looking at middle school students. Go pick your favorite children's book and let's all just sit around and read our favorite children's book and see how well they do with that. And then read a passage from your favorite chapter book and see how they do with that. And so that's a just simple, informal way to assess where that student is. Hey, let's get you to read this passage out the Bible. I know it has a lot of Old English in it, or let's do the NIV and see where you are with that.
NLT.
Yeah.
Hey, it's kind of like the eye test. Which is better, this one or this one?
Yes, exactly.
This one or this one?
Yes.
Until they even give you clues. Now look at the C and look at the G. Better, better. It's simple. I keep telling Terry, and we're looking for it. It's not magic. It's not FM. All we need to do is understand and let them read, and then give them what they need to close the gaps.
Yeah. Leave the phonics to the educator. Leave the diphthongs to the educators. As a community, all we're focusing on is developing a love for reading with our students. And how do we assess that? Well, what are you reading? What's the last book you remember reading? And if you can't remember, then here, this is the last book I remember reading as a child, and I really loved it. Maybe let's start here. What do you like to do for fun? Okay, let's find a book about shoes. Let's find a book about basketball. Let's find a book about mathematics and start there.
Okay. All righty. And we're winding up here. Please share. Here are some resources again, and share with everyone, Phylicia, because you shared with me, and I'm going to get some of these, especially stamped. Tell me a little bit about these resources.
So we talked about Project Lit last time, and that's a place that you can go. You would like Google search it, and that provides books written by Black authors with Black main characters for students to be able to look at. And it has children's as well as young adult books on that list. And then Karma's World is on Netflix, and it was developed by Ludacris as a way to get students to learn more about hip hop and how language can be used to, create words and to solve problems and things like that. And then Gracie's Corner has really taken off with teaching phonics to students, really any student, because she incorporates more hip hop beats and R&B kind of tones, and makes it more engaging for students to kind of pick up on their ABCs. It's not just the traditional classical ABCD song, but now we have one with a little bit more rhythm and soul to it. And then Stamped is a little bit controversial, and it's probably on the banned book list, honestly. But it's very informative, especially for our Black kids, because it talks about the history of racism and how it has been sewn into our society and the effects of those decisions that were made way back when, how we see those playing out in our communities today. And so it's very informative, and it's very powerful for our kids to know. Definitely not a book they need to read by themselves, even though it is written for kids to be able to read by themselves. I would recommend reading that with a parent.
Is that associated with Ibram Kendi's book, Stamped from the Beginning?
Yes, ma'am. It's the children's version of that book.
But I don't see his name on it. So somebody else.
That's because WordStream is over the top of it.
Oh, okay. But his name is on. Okay, because I thought, wow, that's very close to. Okay, all right.
Yes, it's exactly that book.
Okay.
And then Kevin Hart, I think he started this during COVID, but he talks about different Black history moments, and he does like little skits and things that talk about Black history. That's also on Netflix. And of course, we have Lean on Me as a great example for how we can conform while transforming our students' minds. And I see here Portia asked, why only these books? It's not only these books. These are only the books I could fit on this slide. They've been limiting me on my slides now.
Yes.
But
I have even found some really good books at the dollar store that we are seeing that more POC, people of color, are being included in those books. So, those well, now it's $1.25. I mean, but just getting a handful of those books and taking them into wherever your children are. I take mine into the Sunday school class so that they have other options. Bianca says, same here. You go to the dollar store too? We all go. Every dollar stores are everywhere.
Mhm.
But it's so funny thinking about the books and different things that we do to try to have what our kids are exposed to look like us. Coming up, my mother used to do things like, if she had statues, she would get paint and paint them brown. Or if there were books that she wanted us to read, she would color them in brown. So, I mean, our previous generation understood the value of making sure that we could feel good about who we are even before we had all this. But we have so much out there now that's available to us. All right. I tell you what, we have come pretty much to the end of our road on this. I'm going to open it up for any questions that anyone would have at this time. We'll take one or two questions. If someone out there has a miscellaneous question that maybe we haven't addressed in the presentation, please pop it up on the comments. If not, then Terry will probably sing, and you're really going to wish that we had asked that question. Terry, do you have any last minute questions or thoughts or anything?
No, I just appreciate Phylicia so much. I am not an educator. Eileen is an educator. I am not an educator. And I feel like what I've learned in the past 60 days has been criminal. And I think that we can continue to look to school districts to do this for us. And they are going to continue to struggle because they can't make decisions to do things because the decisions come from on high and other places. And I think the community, particularly the faith-based community, needs to pony up and jump out there and get involved in trying to make sure that every kid in our community is where they should be, and not make these academic arguments over, to your point, diphthongs and phonics and the way you do it and assessment are not evidence-based. I think that just really mucks up getting regular people like me involved in helping kids to read.
Raylene has asked a question: how does a child learn to read when the parent can't read?
That's good. We see that a lot, especially in the inner city. And when I hear you say can't read, I'm assuming standard English because we know street smart and book smart. And so there are programs for adults, which is, again, where the community comes into play, and being able to provide those resources for parents to say, hey, why don't you take this book home and read with your kid? And then both the kid and the parent is learning to read at that point. So again, start with the reading a child's book at night, just the simplest form you can find, and grow from there. It really just starts with picking up a book. And so
I think this is the point where the community person, whether it's in the church, can identify that and find a very tactful way to work with that parent without making them feel ashamed of the fact that they can't read. So we pray for a lot of grace, especially coming out of churches, to realize that and understand what these parents are doing. Also, Miss Portia said, I came in the middle. What's all this laugh really about this conversation? The conversation is, how do we contend for our children? And the subtopic is, Alex still can't read. We took the statistic here in Kansas City public schools and charter schools that said basically 85% of the third graders were not reading at level. And so that's the whole point. Why can't they read? And what can we do to help them? So we started this discussion last month, and then people wanted to continue the conversation. So here's where we are right now as far as this discussion today. But Portia, if you're here in Kansas City, or Raylene, if you're here in Kansas City, I tell you what, that one of the things that we will be doing is on Saturday, we are hosting the Contending for Children initiative, the conversation around creating a faith-based response to literacy and mental health challenges facing the children of Kansas City. And so this will help us to have this discussion. It's at Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church. There is no charge. We have Angela Guzman from Children's Mercy, who will be sharing some of the issues based on two discussions we have for Contending for Children, one around mental health for children, and the other one is around reading for our children. And Rebecca Dove will be there to share an assessment that could possibly be used as part of the faith-based response called Read to Think. And I'm Eileen Epps Hamilton. I'm with In the Word Ministries, and Terry is with the NIA Project. And so we're working together on this project because they can't read and we can't take that anymore. And then our children mentally are just the number of suicides that have increased in Kansas City. You may have heard of those increases in Lee Summit and some of the news reports last week. Kids are cutting. They are between the ages of 10 and 14 years old. We used to just think about having fun between 10 and 14, but there's so many things around suicide, anxiety, and depression that we really need to begin to address this. So Portia gave us a smiley face, and we're going to take that smiley face. And also, Raylene, you said you're here in Kansas City, so please join us. It's only 2 hours from 10 until noon. And let's continue the conversation around this. Okay? All right. And that's pretty much it for tonight. Any final words, Terry? Any final words, Phylicia, before we say goodbye to our guest tonight?
I just want to kind of give a charge to educators out there and say, if there are programs and strategies that you're implementing in your classroom, to pause for a second and really ask yourself who benefits from this strategy that is being implemented. What culture benefits from this strategy being implemented? What type of student am I really teaching to? And not just differentiation, but really looking at the core of it and the purpose behind what you're teaching.
Okay. All right.
Phylicia, I guess my closing question for you is there a, for lack of a better term, group, institution, is somebody policy level on board with what you're talking about, or is it still kind of a low level mumbling among the Black teachers and and maybe some colleges and universities who's starting to study it? But is anybody at the real policy level paying attention?
Yes. So there are marches on Washington, and where there are programs that, so I'm a home scholar, and I'm part of an organization that they go to Washington twice a year, I believe, where they present policies to lawmakers and explain the importance of why standards and curriculum needs to change. And yes, policies are being impacted, which is why we see and saw a lot of that whole critical race theory blow up, because that was taking something like this and tainting it into a way that it's like, whoa, we don't want that. And so you see the progress in the resistance, right? So yeah.
Very good.
Really, that's very informative to understand why.
Need to know. So we
why
need to
that
know.
goes up. And then I think we also, on the local level, need to be more diligent as we look at the education boards that are elected and who's running for a position and who's in those positions We really are saying that we don't want to do advocacy, but I think we're kind of in the middle of some pieces of it. If we can at least come to the table and let them know that, hey, we're watching you because we're not seeing what we need to see.
And Eileen, I think what you said is really important. We don't have to get in the advocacy boat, but we need to know who's in those positions and hold them accountable, especially at election time.
Oh,
Exactly.
before election time. Yeah, I tell you, they're in every church.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so much. Okay, we'll be in big trouble now with our minister and everybody else who we've talked about today, but God will give us grace and coverage. All right, everyone. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see everyone at the event on Saturday, and we'll leave that up. If you have any questions or comments, please. Here is my information. Let me make sure I put that up today. If you would like to contact me with reference to additional about the conversation, what we're talking about, or anything else, if you would like to join us, we would love to have you join us as we create this. I keep telling Terry, innovation usually comes from outside the discipline. So what we need may not come from within education and by the powers that be, but it may be from us, parents, grandparents, and those who just love children who can contend for them and make a change. So, with that being said, we will tell you good night. Good night, Terry.
Good night.
And good night, Phylicia. Thank you. And for everyone else, we'd like to also say good night as we complete our show. We'll let you know when the next time we get together on WordStream. Thank you for joining us. Bye bye. Phylicia. Phylicia. Are you gone? Terry, okay, make sure
We're
in.
still live.
Yeah, it's gone. So what did you think?
I think we're still live.
No, we're not. It says in broadcast. Goodbye, everybody.